Ladies and gentlemen, this RedGamingTech.com video, we're going to be further discussing the financial situation of Sony. As some of you may know, they've been having some financial issues right now, and the newest installment into this saga is that 40 of the executives in the company, or around that number anyway, have decided to forsake their bonus. This move has been pioneered by Kaz Hirai, which is the new CEO. And the idea behind this is to basically, if obviously they're not taking chunks of cash out of the company, it would be better to keep the company on a more positive float. Speaking of which, they are actually predicted to be making a profit this year, which marks a vast improvement after last year, which was the worst in a decade for the company. Sony are expected to make an estimated 260 million in profit from the full financial year. Now bear in mind this is an estimate, so it could turn out to be a little bit more or a little bit less. However, this has been helped by a couple of factors. The first is the selling of various buildings in around Tokyo and New York, and also the weak yen is also helping in terms of the exports and so on. Kaz himself, when he took over as CEO, made some big changes to the company, and he actually axed around 10,000 jobs. The idea behind this is obviously workforce is one of the most expensive assets of a company, and therefore less people equals less expenditure. He's basically trying to make the company more lean and more able to weather the financial storms. Now, right now, one of the big problems for Sony, or two of the big problems, are the cell phone market. The cell phone market for them, they haven't really cracked, and therefore it's somewhat leaky and turbulent, as well as the TV. Now, it's kind of weird because the PlayStation represents one of their absolute best assets right now, and this is a huge turn up from just a couple of years ago. Well, basically back in the days of the PlayStation 1 and early PlayStation 2, because when you think about it, Sony were synonymous with the PlayStation, with the television brand, and certainly with music. Everyone just wanted a Sony TV or a Sony Hi-Fi or Walkman or whatever. Now, of course, that's not really the case. They've got numerous competitors in the various markets. For example, LG, Apple, of course, have dived headfirst into the music industry and so forth. But they are still making a significant headway in the console industry. However, it is fair to say that the new PlayStation cost them a pretty penny to develop. And so when you consider that Microsoft right now, they are in a slightly worse situation in some ways. I'll go into that in a specific video on Microsoft, because there's been some significant news actually in Microsoft's camp, especially from Peter Molyneux. But it turns out that, as you guys probably are aware by now, that Sony's actually got quite a jump on Microsoft in terms of game development time, and Microsoft themselves are reportedly cancelling and canning certain projects, or putting them on hold at the very least, and other projects in terms of games are apparently up to 6 months behind the Sony titles, which isn't good for anyone, of course, because quite simply put, it means there's going to be less games theoretically on launch. Sony definitely have the drop there, and they also have the PR as well. However, while that is definitely an absolute positive for Sony, there are a couple of issues right now. First is that Microsoft are reported to be buying, or trying to buy at least, as many exclusives for the company as possible. And like it or love it, or hate it, should I say, they are apparently forging relatively good ties with Electronic Arts, which was reported a while back. We don't really know the extent of this. It could just be pieces of DLC that are either exclusive or, for example, released earlier. It could be exclusive titles. I don't think that's going to be the case with some games. For example, they don't really want to make, say, Mass Effect 4, let's say, exclusive to the Xbox, because obviously that's not good for business in many different ways and so forth. However, definitely having these developers on Microsoft's side is only going to be a positive. And Microsoft are, It's not quite the state it used to be with Microsoft. Obviously, back in the day, pretty much everyone and their mother had to use Windows. Now it's slightly less, especially in the laptop scene. Laptops, obviously, it's becoming slightly more towards Apple's products. I'm not saying completely, and obviously some people, including myself, by the way, prefer the Windows environment. Nothing against Mac, that's just my personal preferences and so forth. However, Microsoft themselves have a few issues. There is concerns, I've read from various analysts. I don't necessarily know if I subscribe to their point of view exactly. However, because of the cell phone market and tablet market and so forth, as well as concerns that Google themselves are going to start really pushing into the operating system space with either cheap or free, effectively, operating systems and cloud computing, of course, too. The Microsoft days, unless they really push it, could be quite limited. But for all intents and purposes right now, Microsoft have a lot more clout financially. They're making more money, and to be honest with you, they can better weather the storm. And I believe the best way to describe this would be a war of attrition. And basically the idea of war of attrition, of course, I'm sure many of you are familiar with it, but you basically want to cut off your enemy's line of, well, either soldiers, or in this case it could be that they start cutting off exclusives to the company from Sony, should I say, or at least pay a lot so there's little exclusives for the Sony machine. Now, obviously, I'm not saying this is going to be the case, I just use it as a pure example. I think right now Sony are pretty certain that the PlayStation is going to be very important to them. I think, to be honest with you, we all know it's going to be extremely important to them. Fortunately for Sony's case, they have quite a dedicated fan base, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. Obviously, a fan base isn't the same thing as, say, a fanboy, and I don't really like that term either, but and if you enjoy Sony's machines, you're probably going to give the new PlayStation a chance. They're also doing fairly well in terms of developers as well. There hasn't really been any comments yet on developing for the Microsoft machine. There has been no series of delays. However, obviously a delay doesn't necessarily give it an indicator to how difficult the machine is to actually develop for. It could be that Microsoft decided to do some fine-tuning last minute, or what have you. You know, it could be a dozen reasons that doesn't really bear speculating upon, at least in this video. But with Sony's case, they are definitely getting on pretty damn well with the developers. And obviously, some developers have said that, you know, the console, they'd like this on it, or, you know, the CPU may not be as good as they'd like, or, you know, it doesn't make them coffee as they're working, or whatever. There's always something. No system's perfect. I don't care, you know, I don't care. It's a console. At the end of the day, there has to be some give and take, because obviously the console will end up being ludicrously priced otherwise. But generally speaking, they seem to be developing a very good working relationship with the developers, specifically in terms of not just the ease of programmability of the machine, but in terms of the support they are lending and so forth. I've mentioned this in a couple of videos before, and obviously if you're a new viewer, you can go ahead and check those out on the channel. But I think it's fairly safe to say that one of the big issues that Sony are going to be having right now is that they have many wars to fight, and of course it's not just the console industry that they are involved in, and they really don't want to start dragging it down. That's not to say that their cell phones and so forth are being well received, it's just to say that they have so many competitors in the various different markets that they've been somewhat overstretched, and many people would even argue that they haven't been maybe as focused, I believe would be the best way to describe it, as they should have been. However, in a very, 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 very simple turn of phrase, or not turn of phrase, but it's, I suppose it's very simple to say that the PlayStation is continuing to perform well. And without getting too much off the topic on this particular video, it's safe to say that Sony are not only courting developers, and I mean not just big developers, such as, say, BioWare and Capcom, and, you know, being best friends with Hideo Kojima or something. I'm not saying they prefer Konami or whatever, or Konami prefer Sony. I'm just using it as pure examples, but it's also a case of indie developers as well, and Sony definitely are doing a good job with those. But I think it's very safe to say that the next generation of consoles, the PS4, Xbox, and to a slightly lesser extent the Wii, although Wii is also, let's just say they're really reevaluating their plans. It's been a case of people have assumed rather consistently that Nintendo are underpowered, or that they can't, that basically all the Wii U is basically an extension of the original Wii with a different controller. And these aren't my words, these are basically paraphrasing various executives at Nintendo themselves. And obviously they are not out of the war whatsoever. There's obviously going to be new titles from them as well. For example, new Marios, new Zeldas, and maybe even new IP. Hope to God there's going to be new IP. I'd love to see a couple of other games, or maybe even resurgence of older titles as well. That would be good too. But regardless of which, Nintendo are not out of this as well. And it doesn't matter to Sony whether you buy a Microsoft console, or whether you buy a Nintendo console, or whether you're a PC gamer, or whether you're a tablet gamer, or whether you decide that you're suddenly out of gaming and you just don't care anymore. The fact is, you haven't bought their console. In other words, they are not making profits from you. And it's not just a case of you buying their console either. For example, let's say you buy a PlayStation 4 and you also buy an Xbox 720, and you say to yourself, you know what? Most of my friends have an Xbox. I'm just going to stick with that, really. And you occasionally play the odd PlayStation game, but reality of the matter is you predominantly will purchase the Xbox games, and that means that basically Sony are not making money from you, because obviously they get a portion of the fee that is the cost of basically developing, or should I say publishing, a game on their system. And so obviously that's very bad. So Sony are definitely not going to be resting on its laurels, and I think it's fair to say that they are going to have to fight the war, and it is a war, to be honest with you, very smartly. Anyway, I have to confess, from a very non-biased point of view, I'm actually hoping Sony do extremely well in this, because I'm not saying that they'll, go bankrupt or whatever if the PlayStation doesn't, but I am hoping that they certainly put up a very good fight for Microsoft. I don't actually have a preference on who wins, and I use massive quotations there because people are so obsessed with that the console I own, sold 10 million more this year than, your system. And of course, one might have sold, 50 million, one might have sold 60 million or whatever. But in reality, it doesn't really matter. At least to me. I mean, I don't care if my system, or system I own, came second in the war, as long as I got tons of games on it, and I really enjoyed it. Obviously, there is kind of a point where you want the system to do reasonably well, or the company will possibly go bankrupt, a la Sega, with say the Saturn and the of course, Dreamcast, which I blanked on for a second there, I'll confess. But of course, they didn't exactly go bankrupt, but they simply pulled out of the market. Anyway, I think that's about it for this particular video. Hopefully you've enjoyed it somewhat, and I will see you soon. Take care, and bye for now.